We also have Mr. Richard Stanton, the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of GTT, and he joined the company in June 2021 as its Chief Operations Officer Mobile. Prior to that appointment, he was one of the founding members of Alive, a then new mobile network operator in the Bahamas, and Alive has been going very strong in the Bahamas, and I'm sure that, you know, in being part of that launch, it would have been instrumental to the success it's realizing today. Richard has over 35 years of experience within the telecommunications industry, with over 20 years working at senior levels across the global telecommunications industry in the UK and the Caribbean regions, having held management positions with BT Group, and Alive. We also have Mr. Andre Griffiths, the Director of Telecommunications at the Telecommunications Agency Ghana, and he leads the team that is responsible for the licensing of telecommunications operators, managing the spectrum, administering the Universality Fund, and advising the Minister on Telecoms policy. Prior to his current appointment, Mr. Griffiths served in various positions within the public sector, both in Ghana and the wider Caribbean region, including advisor to the Minister of Public Telecommunications, Director of Corporate Services and E-Government Advisor at the Center for Development Administration, which is CARICAD, Head of IT at the Ghana Revenue Authority, and the Head of IT at Ghana Water Inc. And last but not least, we have Yog Mahadeo. He's a consultant for the Ghana Consumers Association, and I'm sure he is quite well known within the Ghana public space. He is a philanthropist, financial analyst, market consultant, consumer advocate, human rights activist, motivational speaker, and a priest. He has extensive experience in finance, marketing, financial modeling research, information technology, telecommunications, and social and community projects. He's also a chartered accountant and has a doctorate degree in finance, a master's degree in business, and a bachelor's degree in law, marketing, journalism, and professional writing. Gentlemen, welcome, and just thank you so much for joining us. To our audience, and just to probably set a little bit of context, at least from my perspective, according to the World Economic Forum, the fourth industrial revolution is a cyber-physical systems involving entirely new capabilities for people and machines. And I understand that there has been some consensus on some of the key drivers of this digital age, such as high-speed internet, AI, automation, big data and big data analytics, and cloud technology. And we're all beginning to have some inkling of the possible impact of some of these emerging technologies, such as AI, robotics, automation, which are already starting to change the jobs we have, the skills we need, and how we learn. And that's just the start. And also our society should also be moving towards the Internet of Things, machine-to-machine communication, smart homes, I guess, for us more personally. And in the wider context, becoming increasingly a digital society and developing a digital economy. However, to participate fully and leverage the technology revolutions and evolutions that have been occurring, we need not only robust telecommunication infrastructure to accommodate the demand, both of the consumers and of the services and technologies that need to be supported, but we also need that sector to be well functioning as well. So just referring to our theme, telecom sector in Ghana, navigating this new frontier, and cognizant that Ghana recently fully liberalized its telecommunications sector, perhaps, Andre, you can start us off by giving us some insight into what this new frontier is. How does that, what is perceived in the Guyanese context?
Thank you, moderator. Good morning, all.
Good morning.
Yes, what we're seeing is a lot of dynamic change in the sector since the liberalization. But there are a couple of things. Obviously, when you look at fixed line subscription, which is the oldest technology that's around, we are seeing I would say similar to everywhere else in the world, we're seeing a decline in that. And I think that is to be expected. So that's your old landline technology. We are seeing strong growth. Of activity in the market, but we also have, typically you don't have that cap on usage that you would find on mobile, and so the implications on consumer are a bit different.
Indeed. Yes, I definitely recognize, and I do agree that the fix, I think, is where considerable potential lies. And I think I'll get back to that, but let's probably hear from Dr. Madeo. If by chance you can just share what you think in terms of the theme, and then we will start to get the ball rolling with some of the other guests as well.
Thank you, and let me applaud you and the PUC, of course, for arranging today. It's good to be here and to discuss topics like the new frontier. And I just want to mention two things quickly. One of the sad things about Guyana and countries like Guyana is we spend so much time focusing on patching up the past that we don't pay heed to the new frontier. So it's good that the PUC has called together today's webinar with this topic. And I'll give you two examples very quickly. One is that the chairman herself, and hats off, they have drawn a line in the sand basically, or draw a line on stone now to say number portability is a must. Here we are, something that should have been in place many years ago. Now we're looking at stopping those gaps. Another is, Andre just mentioned fixed lines. And I'm not blaming anybody, but the reality of the situation is that telecommunication industry all across the world is very lucrative. You take 20,000, I want to repeat this, 20,000 customers, 20,000 customers. You take them over 20 years. At the fixed line rental in Guyana, you're talking about $2.4 billion Guyana dollars, right? That's huge, that's massive. And yet here we are today talking about, the evolution of fixed line. So while we are fixing the gaps of the past, AI is taking over the rest of the world. We are not even contemplating how we're going to get there, but we certainly know, and here is the reality of it all. We certainly know Guyana's next general elections will be directly affected by AI. Every country in the world. We think we had problems before, we haven't seen it yet.
Thank you so much, and you definitely make some valid points. So just bringing in the telcos now, and let's start with Greg Digicel. Give us your thoughts. I mean, you have been in Guyana for a while, you understand the industry, but probably in addition to probably sharing what might be the new frontier in your perspective or from Digicel's perspective, give us some insight into the role you think that the telecoms providers can play in realizing this new frontier, in capturing it and navigating it, and let's see whether or not we can find some commonalities between some of the various views that have been shared.
Hi, good morning, and good morning to everyone joining. I think, I'm a bit. When we say new frontier, look, from a Digicel point of view, I'll probably start with Digicel and I can probably speak generally. Mm-hmm. I mean, for us, liberalization obviously has meant we've been able to enter into new segments of the sector with certainty. So I think Andrea referenced in terms of the fixed line. So I mean, we have our fixed broadband. So it's something we're pursuing. Obviously, as everyone knows, we're also planning to land our own subsea fiber to, underpin those expansions. So we're expecting our subsea fiber to arrive early next year. But certainly driving the rollout of fixed broadband is something we're interested in, and we've started that journey. I think everyone knows from our experience in terms of the mobile side of it, we have no reservation in terms of expanding services across Guyana, and I think people should expect the same from us in terms of the fixed broadband services. I think, look, we're still new, I suppose, from a liberalization front. I think there's some areas that would still need to be addressed in terms of enabling the operators to provide services and also to plan with certainty. Certainly, I think Andrea wouldn't be surprised to hear me say we still need to look at aspects such as spectrum, but then there's also the wider involvement of operators, I think, in some of the decision making. There's a lot of development happening in Guyana. I don't think necessarily the operators are involved to the degree they should be involved. I think there are a lot of new areas or new communities that, the housing in ministry, etc., might be developing. But a lot of times, for the operators, we hear, quite late in the day in terms of what is happening in some of those communities. So I think the earlier involvement in the telcos or the operators in that kind of development, whether it's housing and expansion of the city, etc., I think that's necessary. And I think if we can have provisions as well for the operators, because a lot of times, yes, they're new communities, but then we're battling for space to deploy services. So I think those are some of the things that probably need to be looked at. We need to work a bit more hand in hand with the other sectors of the country so that, we can plan ahead and also deliver the service, when the customers require it. And the remote areas as well, I mean, that's still a challenge for us. Obviously, there's competition in terms of, they have miners in the community, and I suppose miners, especially the areas where you have a lot of gold mining, a lot of the mining companies have their own ideas in terms of whether, communication is essential to those communities or not. And it's a consistent battle in terms of being able to deploy services. So I think there are areas that need to be addressed, but definitely I think liberalization is a positive step. And as you say, you have to start somewhere. And we are very positive in terms of the outlook, in terms of where we are going and also generally where the sector is going.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm not necessarily surprised or whether it's amused or bemused, because I do find that probably still in the Caribbean that we find ourselves in a situation where perhaps all of the entities that need to be involved in infrastructure planning are not brought to the table early enough. So you find that you have this development happening, the roads get rolled out, the electricity and the water get put in sometimes, and then at some point when everybody thinks it's okay, the road is being dug up because something else now needs to go in. So, yeah. I mean, it seems to be not necessarily something that's unique to Guyana, but something that you still see across the region. So I don't know whether that is heartening or disturbing to know. But let's move on and probably just get some thoughts from Bishop. What is the new frontier as you see it for yourself and or ENET, and the role that telecoms can play in that regard?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me on today, and congratulations to the PUC, the chair, and the team for putting this together. I think, when we think of the new frontier and we think that everything that is happening at the application level, and you speak to AI, Internet of Things, and all the futuristic things that will make life either easier or more efficient, Guyana's got some distance to travel. Not that we haven't started on the path, but definitely, like Greg said, you've got liberalization. You are now getting people to be connected. Getting connected is one aspect. Getting connected affordably is another aspect. Getting connected reliably is a different aspect. But when we talk about the new frontier, we talk about, I envision the application layer, which is governments, enterprises, individuals using applications to education, be more efficient, telemedicine, all the different things that we can get that contribute to, greater GDP, advancement in the country, socially, economically, everything else. Government services, we're a large landmass. People are dispersed. It's not easy to cover. But to come to the topic of where does telecommunication could contribute to this, and the reality is, telecommunications is essentially part of our foundation. And like everything else, we need a strong foundation to build on. And without a doubt, we've seen now, broadband penetration is increasing rapidly. But we were also seeing the performance of the networks, the type of bandwidth that you get. It's comparable to first world. We're seeing across all the providers, there's a strong inclination to look at cost. So I think in this year, we'll see a lot of leveling in terms of where the industry will go. I think we'll see the maximum from the providers, but what we'll also see is people having access easily to connectivity. And that access is what's going to bring all the things that, we may not even imagine. One good thing for Guyana is that I am noticing we've got a very young population. I think, over 50% of our population could be considered youth. And they're quickly adapting to new things. And, we don't want to just have to build networks and build connectivity to people to spend the day on TikTok and social media and everything else, right? We want to get to that point where industries are seeing the benefits of, and AI is a word that's commonly used, but even at the basic application layer in which companies can benefit, a lot of that is not quite here yet. And some of it is from historically, expensive or unreliable communications. So they have not built their systems on the thought process of connectivity. We've also got, and I think as part of getting to that new frontier, you have to think about where does fintech fall in this? And we're seeing that's another sector, which is the financial sector, that may need a little wakening up as well, right? Because we want to see more from the banking sector, not the wallet type scenarios, but the core banking sector, the government, the agencies and everything embracing fintech. So transactions become very efficient, becomes very real time. And then you'll see the efficiency of money in play. When you look at something that could be done in real time, as opposed to maybe taking 24 to 48 hours, you could be 2 days ahead. You take the cumulative of time lost, and you could be adding to competitive efficiency as a whole country. So I think telecommunications is just, like we said, one part of our foundation, but it's definitely going in the right direction. I think all the providers understand the challenge. I think the public also needs to understand some of the challenges that the providers face, especially as we talk about the geography of the country, the large land mass, and how difficult it is, terrain, etc., to roll out services in some of these areas, and then population density, economies of scale, cost, etc. But I think one of the things, and I think it's already happening, is you will probably need to see cooperation among stakeholders, regulators, providers themselves, and tackling the the rural scenario as a collective, as it is an upward task. But I think overall it's positive, and we got to think that, you know, we're one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and we got to also know and be optimistic on that and do our projections and calculations based on what we know where we will be in 5 years, and cater for that and prepare for that and build networks and technology to support that. So that's just kind of my first take on where I consider telco and in relations to the new frontier. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I love some of the points that you made, because I think so often we don't always consider that the telecoms is just one layer. Many of the things that Vishak mentioned is in response to now, what are the services, what are the skills, what are the conversations that we need to have in order to build certain things. So, you know, it's really something that I think we need to emphasize. I wanted to just highlight a question in the chat as we move to Richard from GTT, and someone was saying that at least they were having some questions about or concerns about just the power supply. So here it is that we're talking about telecommunications, but oftentimes for telecoms to work, you need electricity. And so the individual was saying that just trying to get onto this webinar, that they were having problems because they had been blackouts in their area. There were some questions also about affordability, which Vishak also mentioned. So Richard, if you can join us now and share your thoughts again about the New Frontier, GTT, and probably the role that it can have. And I don't know if you want to probably just highlight the whole issue of the electricity concern that has been mentioned by some of our audience members.
Okay, I'm not quite sure electricity is quite within my colleagues' domain. But all three of us will have an issue with the consistency of supply at times. Although in my experience in the last 2 years, it has improved dramatically.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's certainly not your wheelhouse, but here it is, you're delivering services, telecommunication services, but if there is no electricity, then that the ability, the quality, just even access becomes compromised oftentimes.
Of course, and we in particular have now have a battery backup services that customers can get from us. So, you know, just to go back to the original kind of question, trying to divert myself away from the power question. In terms of GTT, there was some talk earlier about, you know, fibre penetration, etc. Our plan is to get to 75% of homes passed before the end of 2024, which is a significant improvement in the last 18 months. So we'll be passing somewhere in the region of 155 to 160,000 homes by the end of this year. And then forging ahead again next year. We also, in the last 18 months, have made significant upgrades in our mobile network to LTE. So has competition made everybody up the game? Yes, of course it has. You know, I'd like to reiterate something that Greg said. You know, spectrum is an issue for us. You know, and what is the New Frontier? Well, the New Frontier brings its own challenges. So it's great we can talk about technology and all the things we can do with technology. But, you know, the cybersecurity becomes a bigger and bigger and bigger issue. You would hear all the providers across the Caribbean talking about cybersecurity now. You probably wouldn't have heard them talking about it 2-3 years ago. That's got to be dealt with. That's got to be handled. There are a number of governments in the region that don't have what they need to protect the data that they have. You know, and then the one thing that I really haven't heard people talk about, we've talked about networks and technology and all the really kind of sexy, fun stuff about what you can do with it. Actually, nobody then spoke about the improvements that I would say that the whole industry has made in terms of customer care. Because we can have all the services we want and we can make it affordable and we can have the best networks. But if we don't answer the phone when people have a problem, then it becomes a bigger problem. So that's one thing that I think certainly we've been focused on as GTT, making sure we're reactive to our customers. And I think anybody who's heard our CEO talk or me previously, we accept it was a disaster and we've made massive improvements. Sometimes you've got to take the pain to improve. And I think that's what we had to do. I agree with Vishok in terms of affordable and reliable technology. And that would bring me to a point that I think probably Andre might like to address in terms of the universal service funds or universal service offering, in terms of what that's going to look like and what that's going to enable us to do in the more rural communities across Guyana, which are the challenging elements for all of us, including the government, including their providers. You know, and then the final piece of the jigsaw, probably in terms of that for me, is where we end up going with satellite technology, as that's obviously moved on quite considerably from most of our experiences around satellite technology during hurricanes, etc.
Thank you so much for that, Richard. Andre, it looks as if there are going to be quite a number of questions probably targeted at you, or perhaps some question that where you start and other people would jump in. So we have a question from the chat and just talking about infrastructure sharing and it being part of the new frontier. I guess it probably speaks directly to some of the legislative provisions, but also probably by extension, the willingness of the providers to share their infrastructure, because as I think Vishok had mentioned when he mentioned about just facilitating access and perhaps one of the solutions is that the providers come together to provide the solution for some of the remote areas as opposed to trying to do it on their own. So to what extent might the infrastructure sharing arrangements be sufficiently developed and established to allow that without undue difficulty?
Sorry, I had to unmute the mic.
Yes.
The first thing I'd say is that under the architecture of the sector regulations, the infrastructure sharing is actually within the purview of the PUC and not the telecommunications agency. So I would have to punt that to the commission. No, it's quite under the act, the infrastructure sharing is regulated by the commission. There's one particular area, it's not infrastructure so much, but it is really resource, and that is spectrum that everyone is talking about. We actually do have, I don't think, or I should say we don't have, like some other jurisdictions, provision for spectrum. I want to say spectrum sharing, but not in a very, very technical sense, because there is spectrum that is made available on a commons basis. We're not talking about that. But we're talking about more and provisions for secondary markets and spectrum and so on. We don't have that, and that is something that I think going forward we may want to look at. That's the kind of thing that enables the emergence of virtual network operators and those kinds of companies. So, but we do not have, and I'm speaking strictly from a spectrum point of view, because the other infrastructure sharing is under the purview of the commission. I think that is something that we have to look toward in the future. I just want to say two very quick address two things very quickly. It's actually quite amazing. I think Vishok is the youngest person on this panel, and it's probably not by accident that he is the person who was really and addressed a lot of the future-looking effects that can be coming along, the fintech, the other other applications that can ride on top of the network. But I want to make the point that we see, from our perspective, all of these novel applications that are going to be coming along, they ride on top of the broadband networks, and that is why our focus is really on how do we set up the environment to facilitate the rollout of the broadband networks. And we think that the industry is going to address all of the innovation and all of the service delivery and all of those kinds of things that are going to come on top of that. So that's one thing. And then secondly, very quickly, We did speak about power, I think, coming up at the top of this year, and the telcos, and Richard in particular saying, well, you know, I'm going to deliberately misquote you here, not my monkey, not my circus. He didn't exactly say that. He did say you have, you know, power solutions now for customers. But it's something, we actually did raise it with a team from GTT. I alluded to the decline that we are seeing in the traditional POTS networks, the fixed networks. Technology that is riding towards obsolescence. There is one thing about that technology, which is that it was always on. And in a country like Guyana, where the grid is not always on, your telecom network was always on. And that is something that we're going to have to address. Very anecdotally, I know many people. Now, you know, we have, you will have something like a scheduled blackout for maintenance from GPL for 7-8 hours. Richard, I don't know what's the longest battery backup that you fill with your service, but we have a real issue where now, as you yourself said, Michelle, during those periods, then the customer is without access, and it is a gap that is being created as landlines are being phased out, and someone has to fill it. So that's my 2 cents very quickly on the power issue.
Yes, thank you so much. And I mean, it really does crystallize the challenge, and I'm very glad that at least we spent just a little bit of time on that. But I want to just shift the conversation a little bit again. We spoke about access, and I'm probably talking about remote areas and probably what might be a solution there. But I think I just want to highlight as well, just we tend to categorize all of that as like digital inclusion, nice, sexy word. But oftentimes we're talking about connecting remote communities, underserved areas where the economies of scale may not exist. But I think there's also just other categories of peoples that often get overlooked. And for example, the persons with disabilities. And so just matters related to the tools that might be available and offered by the telcos to facilitate these persons also having access and inclusion. So probably let's start with Greg from Digicel. Let's give us a sense, please, as to perhaps whether or not, or the extent to which or whether or not, or the extent to which digital tools, especially for persons with disabilities, is available and being offered, and what the response has been.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah. I mean, we have done, I suppose, initiatives with a lot of the associations, whether it's the Blind Association, etc., where we've done, but a lot of it is tailored around devices. So it's more in terms of what devices are best, you know, for the blind, for instance, they may want bigger buttons on the phones, which is a challenge nowadays because all the smartphones now are coming with no buttons and they're all, you know, with a big screen. So I think a lot of this is kind of individuals, or we deal with individuals or associations on that front. And we try and meet those needs, you know, individually as we go. I don't think that generally, I mean, if I'm being honest, I mean, generally in the stores, I think a lot of the devices, etc., that the customers may seek don't necessarily cater for as wide a base or wide a section of the population as we would like. But we do do it in terms of one-off arrangements. In terms of, I suppose, apps, etc., that persons with disabilities may use. I mean, there's so many out there. I mean, we don't recommend, but I know people use various apps. I suppose the key thing for us is to make sure they have the service where they can use those apps. Where, you know, a lot of them are education apps, etc., for children with autism. I know that's a big one. So I think the main thing, we partner with various organizations out there, and you know, whether it's special needs, but I think if I'm honest, a lot more can be done. A lot of this, I think it's normally driven by the associations, and we do, you know, with a true arrangement with them, we would provide, you know, what is being asked for at the time. But in terms of the general provision, I suppose, you know, there could be some improvement in that area.
Yes. Okay, well, let's also, Vishak, I have a question for you. It's in the chat, and it is speaking about 5G, and I know that ENET was made the news recently because of some new technology that it had introduced. I think it's 5G VoLTE, and the question comes from Elroy Halley, who says, with the increased disposable income and availability of 5G devices, when can consumers expect operators to provide the upgraded service that would enable them to fully unlock the benefits of these costly devices?
To quickly answer that question, so we have 5G available in all the major towns. And so we've got, New Amsterdam, Port Moran coming down the line. We've got from Enmore all the way to Diamond Grove, areas in the West Coast and on the Essequibo. So right now you could use, if you've got an iPhone, if you've got a Xiaomi, you can access 5G. One of the things that is critical with both 5G and VoLTE is a lot of the times the devices need support from the vendor meaning the manufacturer. So for you to get 5G activated, you can buy a Samsung 5G phone. And if it doesn't support the specific networks or the providers haven't worked with that vendor to get the network enabled, you're not going to be able to use some of the features. So I think there's going to have to be a lot of education as all the networks move towards VoLTE, etc. That a lot of devices may not work in the market. One good thing is on the Apple ecosystem, it's a simple one size fits all in all their models. So we've got both 5G and VoLTE and Apple already. And on Samsung, that's something that's going to be happening soon as well. And then some of the other bigger brands. But when you look at, a lot of people don't realize, and it's something that we need to take up at the consumer level. There are a lot of devices that come to Guyana that are meant for the Middle East and different places because they may have cost benefits or tax benefits how they get here in terms of the base price. But when they come in the market, like for instance, they may not support the right Wi-Fi frequencies. So you got a pretty high-end phone, but it does not support all the bands in like 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. So you get a very poor experience. And there's nothing to do with the telco side. This is just in-home Wi-Fi. And then you got to look at the bands, like we use a band 28 for 700, which is different from the US. So you would need to make sure, even though it's the same 700 megahertz, but both GTT, Digicel, and ENET, they would use band 28 as opposed to, I think it's band 12 and band 17 in the US. So getting a device, and ensuring that device has compatibility with the networks that would be available locally would be something that we have to focus education well. But to answer the specific question, once you've got a compatible device with our network, our 5G is up and running and our VoLTE is running. Thank you.
Great. Yes, this whole issue of 5G and the having the device that is suitable for it, because what often is happening is that if a country has 5G, if a provider is providing 5G and your phone is not compatible, then you end up in a situation where you will get what the technology that your phone can handle. So it's something that I think we all need to consider. Jorg, let me bring you back into the conversation. And just in terms of consumers, because I think what is coming through, and from just the questions in the chat, I'll just give a general consensus and then maybe I'll target some specific questions at individuals, where we're talking about inclusion, where we're talking about whether or not, or the extent to which, not necessarily just even people with disabilities, but the elderly, are there other groups that perhaps may need some specific support and assistance to help them to be part of this whole digital journey and the evolution that is happening, the technology evolution that is happening in Guyana?
Well, a couple of things I would say in response. The Guyana Consumers Association, we ourselves, in interacting with people, we've been asked about, how can people with certain disabilities have access? Gregory said it, looking at people, blind people, for example, requiring certain devices. And also what we have been telling people is we have to all educate each other, start learning how to activate voice services, which is a big thing. Start using the voice apps on your phones to ensure that you're able to interact without having to look and feel kind of things. What we do know is that in the US, for example, I think the three major providers, they have provided or given the ability for blind people to hear their bills, to listen to their bills. So yes, I mean, things are happening. But one of the things I thought while Andre was presenting too, that I want to put back on the table, while consumers are anticipating and looking forward for all of the things that the new age and new frontier is going to bring, we of course would continue to be concerned about the importance of affordability and the fact that there are times when there is double, triple, multiple dipping into the pockets of consumers for the same service. And I quickly want to mention one of them before I get to what I wanted to get out of Andre. Let's take, for example, the expiry of people's monies. They buy credit or they pay for credit, they pay for something with the expectation to use that to speak. But a certain expiry date comes up and the money is gone. If they don't renew, if they don't pay X amount of money, it's gone. That's their money. Something has to be done about that. Two, you look at, for example, consumers have to pay over and over and over and over again for things like a simple, inexpensive interconnection. And now with more operators in the market, it will be interesting to see how the PUC is going to get that going. To the point though, one of the questions I have is that we have been seeing on social media and newspapers and all of it, that yes, the market is now liberalized. Yes, the PUC is doing all of this work. Yes, new entrants are expected into the market. We have seen, for example, I think a couple of months ago where license was granted to Green Gibraltar. I think what also needs to happen is I know the legislation covers it, and I'd like Andre, through you, moderator, if an expectation can be given to consumers, well, when would those services start? Because now we're talking about expecting new companies to come in at a certain paradigm level. So that's one of the things. And of course, as I said, I'm glad that operators have recognized the need for continued vigilance on the affordability of consumers and the relevance that the communication that they're investing in, of course, it's relevant to the future, because we're looking at education. Already the courts in Guyana have grasped, COVID helped in that way. One can look at the positive of COVID, that the courts, they have done hearings and they continue to do so via Zoom and other platform. But affordability and accessibility continues to be key. Back to you.
Yes, thanks. Andre, I tell you, you're going to be in the hot seat today. So perhaps let's probably hear your thoughts on what Yog has mentioned.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. I think Yog asked, when are these services going to be available and what services would you be referring to?
Well, let me just repeat very quickly in a nutshell. So you have Green Gibraltar, I believe, has been given a license. When do you expect that company and their services to come on the marketplace?
That indeed is a difficult question. It's a simple matter of, I think there's still some issues to be ironed out, which are not issues for the telecommunications agency. If one looks at the Telecoms Act, you would see that there are some powers that are reserved to the minister, and the act actually prohibits the minister from delegating those functions. So it's not even as though the minister could have said, agency, go ahead and deal with this. So there's some matters that still, I believe, have to be resolved, and the resolution of those matters is outside of our hands.
Okay. As I said, Andrew, you're going to be in the hot seat, but before we come back to you, let me rope Richard back in. There is a question in the comments here from Commissioner Nicole Pohl, I think she's from the and she is asking about I think with the whole issue of the power and just the fact that oftentimes if you don't have electricity, the telecoms doesn't work. She made the point, and I'll just read it directly: the sun doesn't shine daily, hence there must be some backup power supply when the battery fails. Don't take my word for it. Just ask the students at the Bina Hill Institute who are still struggling with connectivity to get their STEM robotics club started. How can GTT help the Bina Hill Institute in the North Rupununi Region 9?
I don't know how I've become the expert on power.
I don't know if it's about...
Despite what Andre says, I can do nothing to assist GPL. They have challenges. We're all pinning our hopes that GPL will see the benefits of the investments over the coming years from oil, etc. I don't know the particular circumstances we're talking about. More than happy for you guys to get some information for me, and I will find out what we can or can't do in that particular area. Interestingly, I would just also add to what Dr. Yog was just saying there, and these people coming in, what are they going to do? Where are they going to go? Do they have to stand by the rules and regulations that GTT, ENET, Digicel have to do? Do they have to cover a certain portion of the country, or can they just cherry pick where they want? That's another issue that I think we probably don't talk about enough as well.
Indeed. So Andre, back to you. Just in terms of and it probably speaks to a bigger issue just in terms of the transparency of the licensing, because here it is that these are questions that your providers are asking. Are these new licenses being issued on with probably the same sort of requirements that they have been asked to adhere to?
Well, in the first instance, the particular question as to where the licensees are expected to serve, that would have been published in the official gazette. Whenever anyone applies for a license, they would disclose the areas that they would be interested in serving. There is no requirement that everyone serves every area of the country, but I would say there are a couple of things. Generally, all licensees have the same obligations. When the Telecommunications Act speaks to obligations of licensees, it speaks to licensees in general. There is one particular carve-out, I believe, and that is for operators that are deemed to be dominant, and operators that have that designation are subject to some, I would say, some extra oversight, particularly by the Commission. But with that exception, all operators are going to be subject to the obligations with respect to, I believe, quality of service, and those kinds of things. So there's no, I don't know if that satisfies the concerns. I don't expect it to satisfy the concerns, but I know that answers the question adequately. I can have another stab at it if there's still questions and I'm in a position to answer.
Okay, I just wanted us to proceed because there's another question that has been sitting down, and I've promised to get to it. And it's from Kobe Rodriguez. It's a Facebook message, and it's: with the emergence of new technologies, and Andrew, that is for you, and services such as 5G, Internet of Things, digital payments, how adaptable is Ghana's legislative framework in facilitating these integrations into the telecom sector? Are there any ongoing initiatives to update regulations to accommodate these advancements while ensuring fair competition and consumer protection?
Again, the question concluded with two things that are squarely within the purview of the PUC, that is to say consumer protection and competition. The Telecoms Agency does not regulate those. But with respect to the specific services that were cited, I think 5G and there was another one.
Well, they spoke about Internet
of Things.
Yes.
I think that the Act as currently exists is quite sufficient to take account of those two phenomena in particular. So I don't see any difficulty, any limitation in that respect. One of the things we have our eyes on with the Internet of Things is the way we manage, especially in number spaces. The numbers are a finite device, resource. So that's one thing that we need to have our eyes on. Is the numbers, is the domain names, those are much less of a concern. The IP addresses, far less of a concern. We don't really manage that. That's done more at the international level. And the operators have their own relationships with the the tier 1 ISPs and so on. So, but in terms of the legal framework, I don't think that there's any limitation there that would constrain us from certainly facilitating things like the two particular phenomena that were cited. I should say, though, that we have regulators, I think, in the best of worlds are always following the operators. And I don't mean that in a bad sense. It is just that the technology moves. And I think the fundamental question that was being asked is our legal framework sufficient to keep up with the technology as it is moving now? There are areas in which, again, coming back to the power issue, that is simply, it seems so mundane, but that is an area in which the framework, the traditional framework within which we have regulated those services, it's a quality of service issue. It's going to end up manifesting as a quality of service issue, which that in particular, I don't know if the Telecoms Act is particularly set up to handle. It's handling a consequence of obsolescence and not necessarily something new that's coming on. That's one thing. There, we have, let's say, for example, there's a phenomenon where you know, or there's something that's happening in the market. One particular, the provider is, I can see it, GTT, is offering what seems to be a wonderful package. No, I'm not beating up on them. I'm just exposing how technology is really moving beyond the traditional framework. So in trying to get people to migrate from the copper line to the fiber platforms, there's an offer now that allows people to switch their existing number that came with the copper line onto the fiber net. But the numbering system under that would have governed that POTS network is heavily geographically based, whereas on the fiber network, it's network based. So the entire network, you got 500, 501, 502, so on and so forth on the network, and that consumer can be anywhere in the country. We now have to look to see how we manage the number space, how we're going to have to go back to manage the number space with this move, because somebody moves in area X, moves their existing number onto the fiber platform, then they move, and maybe they move that, into another area. That number moves totally outside of the NXX exchange area. What happens then? How do we manage that? So these kinds of issues, the fundamental question that I discern is, how is the regulatory framework keeping up with the technology? The specific examples that were cited don't pose a problem in my view, but there are issues that we will have to grapple with, and I think I gave a couple of examples.
Yes, thank you so much. The PUC chairman, Ms. Britton, probably wants to jump in since she recognizes that there may be some responsibilities that the PUC may have as it relates to consumer protection, fair competition, and some of the issues that had been raised. So please go ahead, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Thank you so far to all our panelists. It's been a very spirited discussion. I noticed that it would have been remiss of me not to interject, because I believe on 2 occasions Mr. Griffith has invoked our responsibility. And my short answer, because I want you to get back to the first of your questioning, my short answer to the last question as it relates to us regulating Internet of Things and artificial intelligence I believe that we all are familiar with the adage that, that regulations should not stifle innovation. Be that as it may, that innovation itself has to be constricted to things that are above board. And secondly, the legislation, we have a wide legislative berth, but our legislative berth perhaps needs to be looked at again. And PUC serves as the advisor to the Prime Minister on these issues, issues of reform and issues of expansion. That is our direct mandate. So I would want to venture to say, as Vishuk has said, that the industry is evolving almost on its own, and we are continuing to monitor and to ensure that these things are flagged. I think that the debate ranges on as to whether artificial intelligence can be regulated and how you regulate it and how you sort of confine it. I think the cat is already out of the box where that is concerned. But I can rest assured that PUC will continue to flag all the technologies that are in place and the evolving and emerging technologies, and we will make the necessary recommendations. Mr. Griffith should not think that he is off the hook where this is concerned, because it would be a collaborative effort and a collaborative thrust to the minister, who happens to be the Prime Minister, and we will definitely be calling on him to help in that regard, because if our mandate increases, so too should the telecoms mandate as well. And to the last point I wish to say, one of our key functions is to investigate. And so investigate is a wide function. And so that is, I think, for now, should there be an issue, that investigative mandate and function can be used in part to regulate, and I'm using the word regulate here loosely, to regulate emerging technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. York, I think you had some questions.
Yes, thank you. Just a quick follow-up question to both PUC Chair and Andre. Both of you, we all went through this. The law is supposed to be a living thing, right? So I wanted to ask Andre and the PUC Chairman whether either of whether the Commission or the agency, whether you engage proactively in relating to the powers that be recommended legislative or regulatory changes. Thank you.
Mr. Griffith, would you like me to go first?
Ladies first, or seniors first, we can prefer to say.
Thank you.
Please go ahead, Chair. Seniors first, please go ahead, Chair.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mahadio, that's a very good question. We have collaborated recently on public consultation and quality of service. There was a lacuna in the law and in the offerings of the quality of service as now exists, and we have worked together in that regard. But it was a PUC document and a PUC initiative. But I can certainly tell you that the telecoms agency was hand in hand with us in that initiative. And should there be any other such initiatives, we will, of course, collaborate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, the agency as well has an advisory role with respect to the matters that are within its mandate, and has a role in advising the minister, and we do this. There's a question, I think, of how many hours there are in a day. We have not only, or let me backtrack a bit, this legislation was brought into force fully in 2020, which is only, I think it is going on 3 years. my friends from Singapore, in a previous life, I used to work a lot with people in Singapore. I was told that over there, they have a process of precisely that kind of proactive review, where the stance they take is not why should we make changes, but why should we not make changes? In other words, they have to justify staying static. I think it's a different mindset. It kind of orients you differently and forces you to be proactive. That being said, we are compiling a list of things that at an opportune moment we would want to suggest or recommend to the minister that there be an omnibus at that point in time set of changes. In other words, instead of coming 3, 4, 5 times for changes to primary legislation, we can see occasionally or periodically one should go and move amendments to this stuff. And amendments are needed. We think that the act is particularly heavy and it is oriented towards the big operators, and therefore it imposes a burden on smaller operators. And so we think that precisely it's related to the question that was asked a little earlier, but we think that there could be lighter touch for smaller operators. That is one of the things that which that we have our eyes on. But separate and apart from proposing changes to the primary legislation, there is a wide body of subsidiary legislation that still has to be put in place to really put meat on the bones of this act. We have, for example, the minister issued an order exempting small ISPs from certain aspects of the licensing requirement. That is one thing that came into force. We are currently working on a regime of exemptions for certain types of radio communication equipment, so that you don't have importers who are coming up with IP cameras and Ethernet cards and all kinds of things that under the current trade ordinance have to be subject to import control from the agency, which is the competent authority. So, but there is a part, there's a section, I think 3011 of the Act, which allows the minister to issue a blanket exemption for types of radio communication equipment and the spectrum that they use. And so there are these kinds of things that we think gradually need to be put in place. And so saying that to say that the current Act has a lot of scope for you to take action through subsidiary legislation to bring some of those benefits, not necessarily having to go to the length of changing the primary legislation itself. But I do take the point. Indeed, there are changes that are going to be needed, and we should not, even though this act was brought in force in 2020, if one looks at the ECTEL Act, our act is almost, it almost exactly mirrors the act that was brought into force in the Eastern Caribbean in around the year 2002. So by the time we brought that act into force, that framework was already 2 decades old.
Yeah, that's very sobering because ECTEL has drafted new legislation that is being promulgated among the member states now. So there's plans afoot and in trend right now to update the legislative framework across the ECTEL member states. I want to just transition to an important aspect. It's coming through the chat quite a bit, and the whole issue of affordability, because I think as much as companies or the telcos might be offering exceptional service and probably what they think might be a reasonable price relative to their investment, seems to be a concern among consumers that many of them can't afford it, or it is a challenge to afford the service. I think let's start with Greg from Digicel. Let's talk about just the whole issue of affordability, and of course, consumers want to know what could be done to lower the price.
Well, I think the the main thrust of liberalization was to bring in competition. We believe competition forces the operators to be innovative in their offerings and in terms of both in terms of the services offered and in terms of the value to customers. So we don't see it any different. I mean, there's going to be even more competition, I suppose, going forward in both the fixed broadband and the mobile broadband sectors, and we expect to see, or we are certainly, speaking for Digicel, going to play our part in terms of innovation and pricing in that front. So, I mean, I'm not sure I want to have a discussion on what may or may not happen in the sector, what the different operators may do, but certainly we expect to see significant competition which will positively impact customers.
Well, I mean, competition often does that, but I think what has been happening, it's a trend in the rest of the Caribbean, and perhaps I think it will be reflected in Digicel based on the fact that it is happening elsewhere within the organization, is that what people are finding is that download the transmission speeds, so the download speeds, the upload speeds, the packages are changing, they're getting faster. And maybe the price is maybe increasing slightly or staying the same. But what I think is often a challenge is that just even the baseline prices for relativity, yes, speeds might be increasing, but people cannot afford. So there sometimes I think that's the concern that the way how packages have been set, it does not consider those who may, have lesser means. And so, as I'm almost paraphrasing the acting managing director of ECTEL, we were talking about affordability, and she makes a point about everybody might need a car, but not everybody needs to drive a Jaguar. So we need to probably ensure that there are packages at varying price points because of the nature of the income of many of your consumers as well. So I think it's something to note. Probably let's hear from Go ahead. All right.
I was just going to add, look, there are two things. One, as I suppose we move both in terms of the digital age, I think consumers would become more and more involved in deciding the packagings they want. There's also a lot of activity, I suppose, across most of the telecoms in terms of segmentation. But I think there is a change in the telecommunications, especially from a Caribbean point of view. And I think traditionally the telcos in the region relied on things like incoming voice revenues from operators in the US, etc., where most of their traffic originated. That market has significantly declined. I think the point that needs to be addressed is going forward, if the networks are going to be responsible for investing more and more, if you like, from a data point of view to make sure all these apps, etc., run on top of them, how would the Caribbean operators then share in the pot of, in some of the bigger regions or bigger countries, Facebook or your Googles, etc., they do some kind of revenue share arrangement with operators. The problem we have is Guyana, I suppose, on its own, and maybe even the Caribbean on its own is a small player. So how do you get to the table to have some share in that advertising pie, etc.? So you're providing a network, Facebook and everyone is on it, but you don't have the numbers to go to the table with Facebook and say, well, we need a share of that pie. So I think it's a bigger issue that needs to be looked at regionally. It may be that the Caribbean markets also need to partner with the Latin American markets, etc., to look at, how are we going to be able to negotiate with these over-the-top players? But I think it's something that needs to be looked at. I know Kanto has started taking some steps on that front. But I think we have to acknowledge that the model that networks in the past used to finance a lot of the capital expenditure has changed. And we have to look at how do we deal with that going forward. And I'm not saying we have the answers yet, but I think from a Caribbean point of view, we need to decide how is it that we're going to engage, these major operators who at the moment don't see the Caribbean as material and they don't feel they need to have any discussions with us.
Understood. I mean, I'm going to just rebut, but I'm going to ask you to jump in shortly, because I question whether or not, here it is that the subscribers are paying for access. And now it looks as if you're suggesting that in addition to the providers paying for the access, paying for the service and having access to the internet, that you now also want to be paid on the other side by the entities that are sending content down the pipe that the customers in Guyana are asking for. So
I suppose if the operators in Europe and all the bigger markets are doing it, I mean, why would the Caribbean markets or Caribbean operators not want to do the same? I mean, it helps also to subsidize costs or keep costs down, if you like, for the people in the region.
I'm not sure if the telcos are doing it overseas. I know that countries are taxing like Facebook and so on, Google as well. So, but I'm not aware of the telcos getting monies from the.
And once again, but just in terms of being able to get some share of the advertising, even. So I think there is a model there where in bigger markets, operators are able to get some revenue out of it. Now, whether it's direct or whether you're saying the government passes it, takes a tax to pass up, there might be different models, but I'm saying somehow or the other, if you're looking at, I mean, we're talking here, especially earlier, we're talking about going to remote areas. The point is, at the end of the day, the business case doesn't exist for that. So how do you fund some of these things in the future?
Yes.
So I think I understand the point you're making, whether it comes directly or indirect, as long as it comes to the region, I think that's the key focus.
Understood. I think, though, as I think Bishop had mentioned, I guess whether or not in terms of access to remote areas, there's just a question as to the extent to which the telcos themselves are prepared to collaborate and thus just to facilitate the access. And you can figure out among yourselves how you may share whatever revenues that there is to get. And I guess there's also just the fact that there is supposed to be a universality fund, which should also help with respect to offsetting some of these costs into remote areas. But Vishal, let's hear. Go ahead. One more.
No, I was going to say the challenge with that is that you're talking about small populations. So even if two operators come together and say, well, I'm going to share the capital costs to provide services to 600 persons, the reality is 300 persons can't compensate you for the 50% you're paying. So collaboration, yes, but, you're making a small pie even smaller, so the recovery of the capital expenditure becomes even more challenging. But I'll let others jump in.
All right, yes. Vishal, let's hear from you, and then Richard.
So just to clear up, collaboration is not the only way to get this done. I just said it could be one of the methods. And
yes.
Some of the sentiments of Gregory, if you got 10 people in a village, if 10 of us collaborate, it doesn't get it any better, right? But I just said that in essence, we would have to explore all avenues. Collaboration could possibly just be one of them to get that scenario. I think Greg and we should understand and not go away from this without not understanding clearly what Greg is saying. And the conversation went into compensation, but you must understand that we are building networks to support data consumption from the big guys, Facebook, TikTok, everything. That usage demand increases year over year with fees coming down and more network infrastructure going into place. And obviously, fees coming down is an effect of the base getting bigger, meaning more people coming onto the network. But whether that fee compensates fully to where you are covering the cost for that high demand, and we must look at a network, especially wireless network, spectrum-based, has a finite amount of access. So you take a tower, it either has 100 megs, 200 megs, or whatever, and you have a peak hour, 7 to 9 p.m. Everybody's going to try to use the service at that specific point in time, which means you are building a whole network for 3 of the 24 hours a day to compensate for that peak hour. Now, to point out and to support some of the things that Greg are saying, like if you look at all the big subsea cable projects that are being built around the world, they're heavily funded by the likes of the Facebooks, the Googles, and etc. And that's because they need to ferry their content across intercontinent to get it closer to the people that they want to subscribe. And that does not exist in the region. In other words, a Digicel, cable and wireless, a ENET or whatever, we fund getting that content from the US all the way into Guyana. They may provide caches and so on and so forth. So there is a conversation to be had there, what that solution is, but it can't be where you have a third party is sending you an infinite amount of data. We have a finite network and we are expected to make it work every day. You know, like for instance, you get a tech support call, my Netflix is buffering. Netflix doesn't get a support call, right? Nobody calls Netflix to say, hey, it's buffering, or maybe we need a lower bit rate or something. So that's a burden that we're taking on. So we shouldn't get carried away about what may be happening in the first world and not understand our own limitations where economies of scale exist. So I am directly supporting Greg's position. Whether the mechanics of it, I don't know. So I don't want to comment on it. But in terms of cost, we got to look to see that we are becoming data-centric. You know, apps are efficient. WhatsApp is replacing voice and all these different things. So building a good network, migrating to the technology that's more efficient, access to, you know, putting out more fiber, more efficient technologies could help to bring down costs, as well as obviously more areas you've got economies of scale as the network grows. But more importantly, competition is also going to dictate, because, you know, we look at the historical picture of Guyana and you've got big international players that there's no doubt they have built infrastructure outside of Guyana with resources from Guyana. That's very much in the past, but the idea is we are seeing investment from everybody. We are seeing competition from everybody. And we got to ensure that the regulator, and Andre pointed out, the regulator is always behind well, not always, but as many times behind the providers. And I think even if we look at some of the benchmarking exercise that was mentioned earlier, we're not fully happy with it, because we don't think it takes into consideration all the modern technology that is available today. We can benchmark the physical landline, Andre refers it as POTS system, against someone running VoIP and a fiber modem, which that dimension may be changing, but we're looking at the same rate, right? So we've also got to take into consideration where technology has brought in efficiencies, and at the regulator level, ensure that's also getting down to the consumer. So technologies like VoLTE, for instance, is highly efficient as compared to 3G voice. We shouldn't charge the same rate for it. And at the same point in time, we shouldn't penalize the customer because one provider has an older technology, etc. We've got to find ways to balance it to make it work for everyone. So I think cost is something that in a competitive market, you're going to see some benefit, but we can't on a daily basis look solely with blinders on the providers. So the discussion that Greg pointed out is happening in Europe. It is happening in many places where you've got this huge amount of volume of data coming into your network, and you're expected to carry the cost of it. So even as Caribbean people, sometimes we need to ensure that we're supporting the bigger picture rather than getting caught up in the little small squabbles, right? So I think that's kind of would be my general position on that.
Thank you so much, Vishak. PUC Chair, I'm going to rope you in a little bit to probably just respond. There's also a couple to a question in the chat from our audience. But Richard, from GTT, I'm just going to give you an opportunity whether or not to corroborate, refute the views of your other telcos in Guyana.
Sorry, oh, there we go. I'm not going to dilute the message that Vishak and Greg have just gone through because it will confuse the issue, and I 100% back them and everything they've both said. But I would also add, just very, very quickly, I'll give you some time back, is that we do collaborate. There's a perception around that we don't talk to each other and we don't help each other. We've got, redundancy, diverse routes on undersea fiber, etc. It's not that we're working against the country of Guyana for our own benefits. We do work together, and the perception that we don't is sometimes quite frustrating. Now, I get we don't share towers, yeah, and we should do. But I think there's some tech and age involved in terms of the networks. But, you know, we do collaborate, and I 100% agree with them, and we need everybody's support, not just Cantor. The government should be supporting us as well. Across the Caribbean, I'm not just talking Ghanaians.
Indeed. Indeed. Madam Chair, you've heard I guess, the positions of the telcos on this whole issue of affordability. But I also just want to bring in a point that was at a question by Heston Rodriguez from the chat. Telecoms operators play a critical role in ensuring affordable and competitive pricing for their services. How do you balance the need for sustainable business models with the goal of providing affordable rates to consumers? Are there any ongoing efforts to reduce the cost of telecom services in Guyana?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question from the participant. The legislation makes provision for the prices to be fixed on a supply and demand basis. And so we would imagine that with more and more entrants into the market, those prices ought to reduce. And so that is the answer to that question from the participant. Is that satisfactory, or you want me to expand further?
Probably expound a little bit more, please.
I don't want to at this point because, of course, we are now in our embryonic stages of competition, but that is the academic answer that I would like to give on behalf of the Commission at this time.
Understood. At least I guess certainly you want to be able to reserve the right of the Commission to address the situation as it unfolds and not necessarily held to.
Yes, and I'm not sitting here as the Commission today. So yes. I know that this is an academic discourse, and I don't want to go and color outside the lines in this regard.
Thank you.
But the market forces, of course, work almost automatically. So we are still reviewing and observing the thing.
Okay, great. There's a question in the chat. I don't know if this is something that any of the telcos may want to add anything to. I'll read a question and then I'll probably just share my own insights because that might just help us to address it quickly. So Ronald Crawford asked about the rapid advancement of technology has made phones obsolete quickly, but I don't see many opportunities to recycle or safely dispose of older phones or use them to help defray costs. In whose purview does this lie, and what are the operator's responsibilities in this area? So I guess one could also say that there is an entrepreneurial opportunity for someone who is prepared to take it on and facilitate the recycling or refurbishment of some of these devices. But I don't know if there's any specific provision or whether or not even currently the telcos have a system in place for whether phones to be recycled or safely disposed of. And it speaks to, as we evolve as a society and noting, for example, just the impact of climate change and so on, and us becoming a lot more environmentally aware, that we also need to now not necessarily just even limit our view of technology and its impact to the latest phone or what is the latest technology, but a more holistic picture where we also look at the environmental impact as well as all of the other factors that are cutting across our society. So I do think it's a very valid point. Richard, let's hear from you first. And then I'll probably try and move on to the next question. So this is about the recycling and safe disposal, maybe even upgrading of existing phones, noting probably that they're not as resilient, they're not as robust as they used to be, as well as the technology is changing so fast that
they're not as heavy as they used to be either.
Mm-hmm. Well, so, there is that.
I mean, I think, I don't know if there are facilities to recycle phones in Guyana, I guess is the first part of my answer. Mm-hmm. Should we all look to be careful about how we recycle batteries? Yes, we should. Are there facilities in Guyana to do that? I don't know. If there were, I would be more than happy to collect all the old phones and supply them to a recycler. again, that involves the population at large providing the phones and giving the phones to us to recycle. So it's not strictly within our purview to make this happen. We can facilitate, but I would be interested to know, I'm not aware of anywhere that would recycle batteries. I could well be wrong. I've not been here that long, as you know.
Yes. Greg, what about you? Can you probably help us with whether or not there is a system in place to recycle phones and batteries, and even probably to begin to extract some of the valuable but very scarce resources of which these phones are built, or other devices as well?
Not that I'm aware of. From time to time, I know there are companies that have come along and said they were going to collect phones, but I think the main issue some of them express is that the market is just not big enough for them. I think they can go to other countries and get, significantly more phones to recycle. So it's an economies of scale issue from so many operators we've encountered, but I don't know that there's anyone who's consistently doing it in Guyana or doing it at all, to be quite honest.
Yes. I think, though, one of the challenges that often happens, especially for us as developing countries, and I've seen it across the region, is that we also become the dumping ground for some of the older phones. It may not happen as much now, I'm not sure, but what often used to happen is that because, for example, devices were expensive, and luckily they have gone down in price, or at least you have a broader range of phones that are available in our markets now, is that you may have found that charitable organizations from overseas, suppose they are donating phones to some group or peoples in a country in the Caribbean, and it will be some of these older phones that will probably be considered past end of life in a developed country. So maybe things that may have been traded by consumers overseas to secure a better device, a more modern device, and these then end up coming to the region. And so you may find that you end up having a phone that is not as well, it's already almost at end of life or past end of life, and thus you're not getting as much use and utility out of it before it starts to develop its own problems. But as I did say before, it certainly could be an opportunity for businesses here in Ghana to set up something where you can at least recycle and help to manage the waste that technology is providing in our countries. I'm just looking through the chat to see whether or not there might be some other questions that perhaps we can touch on. Okay, there's a question here. Granted that it's initially, I think, directed at the telcos, but I want to start with Andrew. Andrew, you've probably been out of the conversation for a little while. Talk to us about maybe what might be the short and maybe the longer term views of Ghana as it relates to, telecoms and how the country sees itself evolving. I'm not sure. I did do some research before. I didn't necessarily see like a national development plan for Ghana. I'm not sure if there is one that is current or a national ICT plan for the country. So in terms of, just to give us some insight, whether or not there has been any sort of cogent thought that has been put down as it relates to some sort of framework for Ghana going forward. Where does Ghana see itself in the next 20, 30 years?
First of all, moderator, let me assure you, I don't mind being left out of the conversation at all. I'm sitting, I'm listening, I'm learning a lot. So, you feel free to leave me out. As regards a national development plan, as far as I know, we are guided by a low carbon development strategy, a renewed low carbon development strategy, I think. And I do believe that document is online. And I guess in a sense, that is, it's some way related with the current or the last question that you were addressing, which is the question of the e-waste and recycling. I know that a number of countries have actually put in place e-waste regulations and so on. So maybe that is something that we can look at, certainly within the context of the I would say the overall national development strategy, the low carbon development strategy, because it is wider than just telecommunications. And because it's wider than telecoms, with respect to ICT, all things ICT, including telecommunications, there is currently under development a national ICT strategy that is being run out of, I believe, the Office of the National ICT Advisor in the Office of the Prime Minister. They are collaborating closely with the National Data Management Authority, and I think they are going through some consultations. So that is a work in progress, but it would be there that I would expect that that kind of long-term planning for the sector on a comprehensive basis would be found. Of course, in the consultations, I do expect that they would at some point in time circle to entities like the telecommunications agency, like the operators, like the commission, and so on.
Okay, great. And just because you were so happy to not be left out of the conversation, there's actually another question for you, and it speaks to the whole issue of data privacy and cybersecurity. And I know, granted, that this is not necessarily a squarely telecommunications issue, but I certainly think within the new frontier, we really need to consider it. And the fact is that across the region and globally, data protection has become a critical issue. A number of our Caribbean countries have promulgated legislation to address that issue. Cybersecurity is something that is plaguing us all. And we have been, I think as a region, we recognize that not because we are small and feel as if we're insignificant doesn't mean that we're not on the radar of the threat actors, as well as noting thus that a big challenge that we have is the fact that a lot is happening in the region, but we're dealing with it in isolation and we don't know what one hand is doing from the other. So I think there's a sense though that across the region, we really have to tackle data privacy and cybersecurity. And I think that our audience is looking to have some insight into maybe where that is going in Ghana. I don't know whether or not your agency specifically deals with it, but maybe you can share some insight into what's happening there.
I believe that we have a cybercrime act in place. And the cybersecurity, wider cybersecurity is handled, I think, by the National Data Management Authority and indeed, I believe, the National Intelligence and Security Agency. I think there has been a bill to legally establish the latter that is currently in select committee in Parliament. And with respect to data protection, there is a draft act that is actually in the public domain now, in the stage of public consultation. I think that was put out for public consultation just about 2 weeks ago. So there has been movement on the legislative front to address these issues. And to the person in the chat who is interested in those particular issues, I would refer first of all to the draft Data Protection Act that is out for public comment. I think Parliament has, either Parliament or the Attorney General's team has published it. And again, with respect to cybersecurity, I do know that we have on the cybercrime side, and I believe that would address not only some of these other crimes, but make it, it would criminalize certain aspects of trying to compromise cybersecurity, just to use these terms very loosely. But that we do have a legal framework in place for that.
Okay, that's great, and luckily that Ghana is attending to this with, I guess, some alacrity, because it is such a critical issue. And I think what is happening is that, especially for cybersecurity, we can sometimes feel as if we're on the back foot, because the threat actors are very persistent, they're very sophisticated in their approach, and sometimes it's not even it may not necessarily even be money driven, but it's increasingly being used in warfare for all intents and purposes. So having some sort of framework through which we can address these issues and hopefully develop the linkages both regionally and internationally, I think is so crucial. And data protection, from I think once GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was published by the UK, we realized though that we also need to be proactive, because as a region it depends a lot on international, not necessarily just organization, consumers and customers, matters related to personal data and how we protect it and the systems and frameworks that we have in place. I think we have become increasingly aware of how important it has become. And certainly I think for us individually within our countries, not necessarily just thinking of it from an international perspective. But folks, I think I have held you here for quite some time. And I just have one more question just to probably bring this proceeding to a close. And the question is, as we move forward, the new frontier, I think we have raised a number of issues. We see many of the benefits. We recognize that with a young, liberalized sector, Ghana is still probably wrapping its arms around some of the issues, but now within the context of all of the emerging technologies and the ways in which consumers, whether or not individuals, businesses, and organizations, want to leverage the technology. So the question, though, is what are the greatest risks to the Guyanese telecom sector? And probably let's start with the telcos, and then you, if you can wrap up to give us maybe the consumer's perspective. Let's start with Bishop from ENET, then Richard, then Greg from Digicel, and then we'll have you to wrap up.
Thank you. Sorry, let me just start. Yeah. Thank you, Michelle. When you look at risk,
there's a risk right there.
I'm glad it wasn't just me. Bishop, I'm not sure, we're not hearing you. It looks as if the telecoms has failed us. Okay. Let's move on. Richard, let's hear from you, and then we'll circle back to Bishop in a little bit. So risks.
Yeah, well, I think we certainly need a spectrum plan. I think that's crucial for us moving forward. And then it's going to be very much about how, going back to the Vishak and Greg conversation, how do we make sure these OTT players pay their fair share so that we can bring connectivity to the masses, as it were, for want of a better phrase, to the masses. So if we need to subsidize for certain regions, who's going to pay for that? And I think the government also need to have a strategic ICT plan. Now, I'm not sure whether that's Andrea, whether that's a PUC. It's actually probably a combination of both of those and some others as well. But we need to have that plan. We need to understand where the country wants to go. Well, what are the government prepared to do to help us get good connectivity and good speeds out into rural areas? And will the government help us go to the Facebooks and the YouTubes and support us in making sure they do pay their fair share? I think the governments need to be involved. I think Cantor can do a lot and has done a lot in the last few years, but we need the government to support all the providers across the Caribbean. So that would be my immediate takeaway as what we need to get done.
Okay. And in terms of just risks, because I guess, so I think at least you mentioned about the spectrum plan. So what is the risk that you're seeing?
Well, I think the spectrum plan, and Andrea probably knows better than me, but I think the spectrum plan's been under review for some years now. And I certainly don't see anything coming anytime soon. I think so. I'm not quite sure where it is. Either Della or Andrea may be able to kind of give me a bit more comfort, but I don't see anything.
Okay. Well, Andrea, I was hoping to leave you out of this round of discussion, but the spectrum plan seems to be something that it did come up in the chat, but I weighed it against other imperatives. But please just give us a quick insight into the spectrum plan. I do recognize, though, that there has been some work for many years on harmonizing spectrum management across the region through the Caribbean Telecommunications Union. So I don't know the extent to which Ghana has been involved, but probably can you give Richard some assurances about the spectrum planning component?
I'm afraid there's no assurances that I can give him that I've not given to anyone else from GTT who has raised it over the years that it's been under review. And I think that when the operators speak about spectrum plan, they really are concerned about mobile spectrum. We have, we're pretty much in, what do you call it? We're on a mature path as regards other aspects of spectrum management, microwave, and that's the other thing that concerns the operators. The mobile spectrum space has been problematic, and it's been problematic for going on, or not even going on, just over 2 decades. There are some legacy issues, which all of the operators, I think, are aware of. There's an issue of pricing, or the price of the spectrum. And the question would be, when we tell you the price, are you still going to want it? There has been a serious issue with unauthorized use of spectrum, which has placed us in a position where we really have to try to, there's almost a Gordian knot that we have to unentangle, or disentangle, I should say. And so the legacy issues that we are confronting, apart from, we've got all of these to deal with before we can even come to a space where the people who will ultimately make the decisions are placed with something for. So, for example, if I have operator X coming before me and says that, and they say, or let's say a new entrant, I want X amount of spectrum in 850 band. What do I say to them? I say to them that there are operators who are currently there using that spectrum without authorization from the state. And people have been put in jail for these kinds of things in other countries. And the question is not only, well, what is the government doing about the spectrum plan? The question is, what are the operators going to do about those instances in which there's unauthorized use that is stopping us from rationalizing and putting this thing on a path so that we can, we can have a level playing field for everyone. If someone, the spectrum allows you to deploy at lower cost. And if you are sitting down on 3 times as much spectrum as someone else, you're perpetrating a disadvantage, and yes, we have a duty to do something about it. And I think that I can say that everyone who complains about it is part of the problem. But I won't say anything more.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to Greg from Digicel, and I think Vishok is back online, so we'll get back to him, and then we'll bring back you to give us a consumer perspective. And once again, it's really about the risks to the Guyanese telecom sector. What do you perceive as some of the risks, especially looking at what we're trying to embark and get our arms around this new frontier?
Look, I think Richard probably spoke in terms of some of the concerns that the operators have. I know Andre responded. I suppose, look, at the end of the day, we have customers out there to provide services to, and I think they need, I think the parties just need to find a way in terms of how we meet the needs of each other and ultimately to deliver services to those consumers. I mean, I can speak for, different operators. I think the operators have made submissions over the period. I suppose ultimately, I think parties just need to agree, well, how do we move forward on that front? I think in terms of the spectrum fees, in terms of what has been proposed in the past, I don't think, unless there's a new proposal, I don't think the operators have a challenge with that. But I think some of the legacy regulatory issues, I suppose, need to be addressed so we can move forward. So I think that's probably some partial risk. But I think if generally we're talking about risk, and to add, in addition to what Richard is saying, I think eventually, I think as the oil and gas sector expands, I think there's going to be a limited talent pool for individuals. I think if we look at what the University of Guyana is producing on an annual basis, and I mean, I don't know all the details in terms of what some of the oil and gas players may require, but I think there is probably going to be a risk facing the telecommunications sector and probably other sectors in terms of just being able to get talented persons. So I would say that is potentially one of the biggest risks facing telecoms and probably many other sectors. What happens in it, because we only have a limited amount of resource coming out to the universities and even the technical institutions in Guyana. So how do we all manage to get those resources? So I would say that for me would be stepping away from the telecommunication conversation to some extent. To me, that would be the biggest risk facing the sector.
Yes, thank you for that. That whole issue of just skills availability is something I think that is challenging us all across the region and in various ways, because a finite labor pool and those who people are going to go where they consider it to be most lucrative, and also just I think we are going to suffer because many industries are showing huge potential for growth, and perhaps working in telecoms may not be as sexy as it used to be from back in the day. So it is going to be something that countries are going to have to grapple with, because especially as the technology becoming more sophisticated, the skills that we're going to need to manage the technologies is going to be considerably more than what we are asking for now. Having persons in place that can facilitate and support the deployment and the maintenance of those technologies, recognizing too that consumer expectations in terms of quality of service and availability and reliability and all of these things are also going to continue to increase as we become more digital in how we maneuver through life. Vishak, you're back online, I gather. Probably let's just hear from you again with regard to probably the risk that you perceive to the telecom sector in Ghana in light of where we're going into this new frontier.
Sure. So just not to repeat on what Greg and Richard would have said, but some of the things, I mean, we look at you've got climate change. There's a fair bit of coastal flooding, which sometimes threatens infrastructure, access to infrastructure when there's an issue. We want to, I think, as a group, we would need to work closer with agencies in terms of protecting network assets. So, we see there's massive construction and infrastructure projects happening in Guyana, road constructions, and sometimes we get a lot of damage to fiber networks and stuff, and you got to resolve. And so we'd want to see more coordination on the protection and aligning that infrastructure in a way that it's more resilient. Richard said earlier, there is a lot of cooperation between the telcos to ensure resilience as well. So there's backup in systems being providers that help. And overall, I think we got to work towards education and use and ensuring. So if we want to build a bigger pie, we gotta push towards the use of the network where it creates value. And when I say value, outside of social media and videos and everything else, we're creating and contributing to GDP in a positive way, in which in turns create better demand for telecommunication services and allow us to create more revenue channels as competition steps in, as as prices go down, etc. And we focus on consumer. I think we got to get businesses to step up their game. We got to get industry, government to step up their game. There is oil and gas to some extent. I honestly don't know how big it is in the way for telecoms as some may think, but definitely that comes towards education. And I will go back, you touched on it, and I think Richard touched on it in his initial presentation. But cybersecurity is going to become the #1 threat to telco and trusting telco systems. And I think that's where we're going to need to see a very focused approach on how we look at cybersecurity and how we adapt to cybersecurity and ensure that there is a proactive method as opposed to a reactive type of scenario. So I think that's where we can see regulators, agencies, telcos, private sector bodies, Chamber of Commerce bodies, all these technical people with to consolidate their effort and get a clear understanding of where it is. People in the financial sector, especially, we have a very closed finance system. I mean, I could tell you that even the ATMs are connected internationally via Visa, as opposed to this is something that is, I don't know if it exists anywhere else, but when you're about to make that turn and the communications is becoming affordable and reliable, you have this next threat. So that again creates a hesitation that could get you in the direction of, higher efficiency, which ultimately creates value. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, and a lot to think about, because as one can see from Bishop's comments, it's not necessarily just about telecoms and the infrastructure, but even some of the other layers that now come on top of that. So we spoke about cybersecurity and just how critical it is that it is being addressed, and I'm grateful that at least there is some focus that is being given to that here in Guyana as well. So Yog, if you can just help us now, give us the consumer side of it. What are some of the risks that you see, of which we should be aware?
Thank you, Michelle. This conversation has so many tech contexts that it will require many more conversations for us to address everything. I'm sorry to throw this back on the table. One of the questions I had for Andre, I hope he hasn't disappeared, was what's the value of the universal fund? If you're managing the fund, let us know what's the value, or do we have to write to the non-performing Commission of Information for that information? That being said, though, look, Dean raised the issue of extracting revenues from Facebook, for example. And as we know, as TikTok and more apps are going to come along, there'll be more data utilization by consumers. And consumers recognize that data utilization comes at a cost. It's not free. I can say that as a lower tier consultant that worked for that company at Facebook there, that it was a conversation. It is a conversation, but it's not a reality at this moment where monies are extracted or Facebook or one of these companies can put monies into a fund that can go back to the operators. However, the truth is that legislations and regulations, right? They're established not just to regulate, but to also mitigate some of the risks. And the reason I raised the universal fund, the low population area, one of the important areas for all the operators in Guyana, they've all spoken about it, right? Where there's low population, but there is a demand to meet service, it needs to be covered. And this is why one of the reasons, for example, why legislation looked at universal fund. And the operators have every right to consider, well, how do we make these ends meet? So, Michelle, consumers continue to face the risk of exploitation of their pockets. We not only pay the consumers, we not only pay the operators to use their service, but we also got to pay the government VAT on those services. So both ends, I mean, there is that aspect of it. We already have operators that are forcing consumers to drop current services for a costlier service. The impact on our pockets is real. And, on an immediate basis, we have to pay for services, whereas operators can delay and spread the recovery over a period of time. Sometimes that time might be too prolonged and not assessed and reassessed periodically to see if recovery has already been made. Another sad reality is that, those who know me know I'm going to say this anyhow, another sad reality with Guyana and telecoms in Guyana is that politics will always dabble into the industry. Digital admirably, years ago, forced everyone's hands, showed that you could have a low volume, high volume, low price approach that can work. But at the current stage, we will have replacement of technology for which recovery from consumers will be far above what is affordable and acceptable as well. Consumers will always want the best, but whether we could afford to pay. And the sad reality, as I mentioned, is that politics will continue to hold back the industry to allow preferred partners to get into the game. But both the consumers and the operators are going to suffer for this. And nobody's going to comment on this. I mean, the consumers can say it, but the truth is that the dabbling, the intentional dabbling of politicians will continue to rule us. The fact that the reality of the looming future will and must have us scrambling for solutions is going to only be equated by us looking at enabling PUC, agency, and other stakeholders like the operators to be proactive in recommending to government, these are the technologies coming, these are what we want to do, here is what we want to do, and here are some of the legislation, the regulations need to be put in place. I mean, it's only this week that we have seen the CEO for ChatGPT go to Congress to recommend legislation to be put in place to control that industry. And we need to follow some of those kinds of approaches here, because if we don't, we're, as consumers, we're going to suffer and suffer badly, because what you will find happening is that as politicians and as regulators try to get into the game, so to speak, it's long gone. We're always going to be chasing, and when time comes to talk about the reality of cybersecurity, the horses are bolted. Michelle, I want to thank you for this opportunity to represent the Consumers Association, and I want to thank everyone for such a frank discussion, and thank the PUC especially for enabling these continued webinars. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hugh. And thank you very much, everyone. As you can see, we still have probably more questions that we can get to, but I think it has been just a robust conversation so far. And I think certainly we need to continue the conversations. There are many difficult questions and questions that don't have easy answers that we continue to need to grapple with and understand what are the implications for Guyana. And I could say for the wider Caribbean, because so many of us are going through the same thing, regardless of how long our sector has been liberalized, because the industry is evolving so rapidly. And there's a lot coming down on, for us to grapple with, and consumers have their own interests and expectations as well. But then the telcos have their own, the regulator has their own, government has their own, and we all need to coexist and find a way to which to ensure that we can move together for the betterment of our countries, and in this specific situation for the betterment of Ghana. So I just want to thank you all, at least on my behalf, for coming and for joining in the conversation. And I hope that the PUC will continue to have these conversations, because they are so important, and you can hear directly from consumers what the issues are, and have the telcos, policymakers, regulators respond in essentially real time, though to some degree they may not be able to fully and satisfactorily answer the question, but throwing these questions out, I think does help to ensure that they are aware that the people of Guyana are thinking about these issues as well. So just thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning all. My name is Elroy Halley. I was tasked with giving a vote of thanks. So I would like to say PUC's intention with fora of this nature is to provide the public with a better understanding of the telecom sector, and indeed all other sectors in our continued webinar series, and today was no different. On behalf of the commissioners and the staff of PUC, we would like to thank Ms. Michelle Marias for readily accepting this challenge to serve as the moderator for this webinar under the theme Telecom Sector in Guyana, Navigating the New Frontier, and what a dynamic engagement we just witnessed. Which now provides us with a clear roadmap for a way forward. To my esteemed panelists, we thank you for taking the time from your busy schedules to share your extensive knowledge on the sector and the current state of the telecom sector. We look forward to more dialogue with you in the future as we strive to improve the telecom sector in Guyana. To the staff of the PUC who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that this webinar was successful, we thank you for your dedication. As we leave this discourse, please be assured that the PUC will continue to ensure that both the interests of the consumers and operators are protected. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining us, everyone.